Thank you, Clay. Thank you, Dr. Mitzel, for kicking this off this evening. I'm so pleased to welcome all of you tonight and to introduce our keynote speaker, Darrin Lunde. Darrin's book, The Naturalist, as Clay said, inspired the theme for this year's symposium, and no one else could kick off this evening as well as he can for us. Like Theodore Roosevelt, Darrin Lunde grew up in New York City, one of the world's great metropolises, but he loved the natural world. And while Roosevelt's professional career took him in other directions, Darrin's made a career as a mammalogist. And his work has brought him into contact with all kinds of animals, big and small. He's traveled the remote forests of South America, Africa, Southeast Asia. He's camped for months at a time to survey species diversity. And in the course of his career, Darrin has named many new species. And here are just a few examples of the things that he's named. See if you can recognize a pattern here. Leptomis paulus, it's a small rodent in New Guinea. Chotsagoa chauvansanga, Van Sung's shrew, the common name, a species of shrew in Vietnam. Hylodelphus kalinowski, a species of opossum in South America. Brassimus albinens, or the white-toothed brush mouse, a species of rodent in West Papua, Indonesia. So Darrin, I have two questions for you. Have you named anything that is not a rodent? And could you pick a more pronounceable name for the next species you discover? Of course, if I mispronounced any of that, only you in this room would know. Darrin has been able to make his passion for rodents pay, though, through the publication of his children's book called Dirty Rats. The book asks us to think differently about those disgusting rodents and the positive contributions they make in ecosystems around the world. And Darrin has several other children's books, some of which we'll have available tonight. Those include Hello, Baby Beluga. So he does have some interest in mammals other than rodents. After the Kill, and the perennially popular Whose Poop Is That? I had the privilege of hearing Darrin speak last year in New York, and I'm just so delighted and pleased to give you the same opportunity this evening in Dickinson, North Dakota. Please help me give a warm welcome to Darrin Lunde.
Thanks, Sharon. That was great. Can you hear me? Should I move this up? A little higher? First things first, let's get this straight. How's that? Good? Can people hear me? No. I don't know if I can go much further than that. How's that? Is that good? All right. Well, it's really great to be here. This is my first time in North Dakota, and I'm really glad that I'm starting out in Dickinson. Really, it's great to be here. And I can get my first slide up. Let's see. Where's my talk? This is everyone's nightmare. Oh. Yeah, let me find it. I got it right here. Yeah, thank you. It'll get better. I got to get back to the beginning. Oh boy, I'm going the wrong way. It'll get better. Here we are. A field guide to Roosevelt the Naturalist. As a naturalist, Theodore Roosevelt wore many hats. You all right? Okay. Very Thank you, Sharon. As a naturalist, Theodore Roosevelt wore many hats. He was a birder, a hunter, a nature writer, a scientist, expedition leader, and conservationist, to name just a few. Looking at any of these attributes individually, they can sometimes seem at odds with each other. How could a naturalist so moved by the beauty of birdsong then go on to shoot these same creatures? Well, in this talk, I'm going to walk you through the major stages in Roosevelt's evolution as a naturalist. And I'm going to show you how, in the end, he brought all of these varied interests together under the mantle of something called a museum naturalist. You may not be familiar with what museum naturalists are, but by the end of this talk, I hope you will agree that this might be the best overall descriptor of Roosevelt the Naturalist. This is New York City at the intersection of 20th Street and Broadway. And Roosevelt was born just a few steps from this spot, and as hard as it may be to believe, it was right here that he first made up his mind to become a naturalist. He was walking up Broadway and passing a familiar grocery store where something caught his eye. And it was big, and it was brown. And he went up to it and discovered that it was a seal. It was a dead seal, splayed out on a board in front of the shop by the shopkeeper, probably put there to attract paying customers, but more than anyone else, it attracted young Theodore. And he was just 7 years old, out on his own, and he went up to that seal, and he could touch it. He had never seen anything like this. And he could run his hand through its very thick and lush fur. And he could look into its eyes, and maybe he tapped its gleaming white teeth with his fingernail. And he was just transfixed. He had never seen anything like this. And he returned day after day to study that seal. He wanted it. He wanted that seal. He was going to get that seal. And he wanted to take it home and dissect it and study it and maybe preserve it and maybe put it on display. Well, Theodore got his wish. He was persistent, and the shopkeeper gave him the skull, which he proudly carried home, and he used it to start his own natural history museum, which he rather ambitiously called the Roosevelt Museum. And this is the skull here on the left. That's the actual skull. We still have it. It's currently on exhibit in the American Museum of Natural History on the first floor, permanent exhibit in the Roosevelt Memorial there. And so up until this time, up until he discovered that seal, Roosevelt had mostly only read about natural history. He was a very sickly boy who suffered from a lot of illnesses, but mostly he struggled with asthma. And at least very early in his life, he didn't get outside very much. His parents, they didn't even really think he was going to live very long when he was very young. And so he was trapped inside all day. But he found respite in his father's library, which he described as a dark, windowless room of gloomy respectability. But here he found joy in books, and he was attracted to two books, two genres of books in particular. He liked books about animals, number one, and he liked books about outdoor adventure. And any book that combined those two, any book about animals and outdoor adventure, was especially attractive. And so later in life, he would go on and say that, well, this book in particular, The Boy Hunters, that was part of a series, the Captain Mayne Reid series, which was immensely popular in Roosevelt's day. They were written for boys, specifically in that time. And one of the pleasures of writing my book is I got to order used copies of these books and just sit up late at night and reading them. And they're really great. They're dated, but they're all about kids going out with guns and catching animals and making museums and living in the mountains and living in the wilderness and returning home to cabins with no electricity and with elk antlers festooned everywhere. They even describe, in this book in particular, they describe how to prepare animals, how to preserve them. They even talk about how to build your own museum. So Roosevelt was reading this and getting these very early ideas about building museums. It also helped that the American Museum of Natural History was founded in his living room when he was just 10 years old. His father, Roosevelt Sr., was a founding trustee. And so from a very early age, Roosevelt had a good firm knowledge of the two radically different kinds of collections that are kept in any natural history museum anywhere, whether it's a small university collection or whether it's a big museum like the American Museum or the Smithsonian. And those two are, as everyone should know, exhibits such as dioramas, which are used for public education, but not so well known even today are the scientific collections. There are vastly more specimens in museums that the public are never intended for the public to see them. They exist for science. They're there for use by serious researchers that are studying some aspect of the biology of, well, in this case, rodents. These are voles. But that second slide shows you what's typical of a scientific collection. It's one after the other, after the other, after the other, collected from different times and different places, showing the whole range of diversity for every species that you could ever imagine on Earth. In fact, everything we know about life on Earth comes from, ultimately, it can be traced back and comes from this basic record of life that we have. Every field guide that you ever pick up traces back to museum specimens like this. And so Roosevelt was very familiar with this. And he took his own boyhood museum very seriously. And he studied taxidermy, starting at a very young age. He was 10. And he studied with one of the best taxidermists in his time, a guy named John Bell, who, incidentally, he was the taxidermist for John James Audubon. He was Audubon's own taxidermist that traveled with him in the American West. And this snowy owl is one of Roosevelt's earliest examples of his handiwork. He was pretty good for a 10-year-old kid, right? And that owl is also on exhibit at the American Museum in the permanent exhibit where you could see it. He was also, though, he learned how to make traditional museum study skins like this purple finch. And like a good museum curator, he had a catalog, very neat handwriting, I must say. And he made tags for his specimens, prominently labeled Roosevelt Museum. Just look at that. He's 10 years old when he's doing the taxidermy. He's 12 years old when he's really starting to make study skins. He's 14 years old when he's starting to put this catalog together. This is a professional museum. If I saw this and didn't know it was from Roosevelt as a young boy, it would look like something from a serious museum. This is really high quality stuff. And he did this for 8 years. He started when he was 14, and he kept this up on a regular basis until he was 21, adding specimens. This is just one page of the catalog. And by the end of that period, his catalog of zoological specimens from 1872 to 1879, and he didn't stop in 1879, that's just when he stopped this catalog. He recorded, he collected, he preserved, and he diligently measured and wrote down the natural history and described the scenarios in which he got all of these things. 224 mammals, 931 birds, 50 reptiles, 130 amphibians, 160 fish, for a total of 1,495 high-quality natural history museum scientific specimens. It's incredible. It's just incredible, before he was 21. Now, I found this out about Roosevelt. It just blew me away. It really, really got my attention when I learned this about Roosevelt. because I got my start as a naturalist in exactly the same way, roaming, that's me by the way, roaming the streets of New York City and picking up dead squirrels from the road. I never found a seal, but I found squirrels, opossums, raccoons, birds that crash into windows, little mice you could get by putting traps out. And I think there's something significant about coming from a city, which is nature devoid. Cities are nature devoid places. And I remember when I discovered nature, real nature, it was just captivating. It was so real because it was like something I had never seen before. And when I got back, these are just little trips we made to the country, and I was like, I can't believe that this actually exists. I had only seen it in books. And when I saw real nature in upstate New York and other places, I was just so caught up with nature and so enamored with it that I needed it to be around me. And so in the city, I taught myself taxidermy, and I started collecting specimens, just like Roosevelt. That's a purple finch, too, from my own museum that I created. And there's my catalog, and my handwriting isn't anywhere as neat as Roosevelt's, and my comments may not be as insightful. But for me, it was that was my introduction to nature. I was always around places where I never took nature for granted because I was in places where there wasn't a lot of nature. And so I had to preserve it, and I had to keep it. And that's how I related to nature. Now, in my case, I went on, as was mentioned in the introduction, I went on to spend the rest of, from that moment on, pretty much right there, 1983 on, I've been nonstop museums. And graduated college, worked at the museum in college, went straight after college to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and I was there for 20 years. And that whole time at the American Museum was a big part of the job is maintaining these collections, which I've talked about and I'm going to continue to talk about. And believe me, all of this relates to Roosevelt because it really brings all of the disparate parts of Roosevelt's life as a naturalist together so that you can understand them in one place. But to explain a little bit about what these kinds of museum naturalists do, so 20 years at the American Museum of Natural History, and then I changed jobs and went down to the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., and I've been there for the past 7 years today. And it's just a blur. It's just a blur of field expeditions, just going to all of these crazy places. And I have to stress that these are museum expeditions that are going out. The world is not known. It's unknown. There are still things out there that are new that need to be described. And these expeditions go out places like South Sudan or Uganda or Central African Republic, or you just name it. It just goes on, pushing in, getting deeper and deeper. That's what museums do, not just me. Getting these specimens, describing new species, documenting them, tagging them, keeping the catalogs. So I did that, and it's been nonstop, and it's been great. And Roosevelt started out the same way. There's the boy naturalist right there, the guy with the seal skull in the impressive Boyhood Museum. Except he took a much more circuitous path. He went through many different stages, and I could have broken this up even more. I could have broken his boyhood natural history phase up into 2 phases. Every one of these I could have broken up. But I settled on these, and it's very complicated. Well, not complicated, but very interesting the way he was constantly reinventing himself as a naturalist. And he went through all of these different stages, developing himself as he went, and learning and transforming himself and growing and getting smarter and having better ideas. And the interesting thing to me is, in the end, he went full circle and went right back to being exactly this kind of museum naturalist that I'm talking about. They did the same things back then, these expeditions, and he did that after he left the White House. And so I'm going to walk you through all of these, and I'm going to take a little closer look at how he developed. And in the end, I hope to convince you that that this is a part of his life as a naturalist that just hasn't really been recognized or well understood. Hasn't been well understood because people don't really know what museum naturalists are and what they do. And there's just never have been very many of us, just a few hundred, maybe 1,000 worldwide that do this kind of stuff. So let's go back to his boyhood, and let's talk about some of his role models. Who is this guy here? That's Spencer Fullerton Baird. And he was a very prominent naturalist in Roosevelt's days. And naturalists were much more popular figures back then. People knew the naturalists, not like today. They knew these people. America was in that stage where they were westward looking, and nature was much more to the forefront than it is today. So Baird was like Roosevelt. He got started by building his own boyhood museum. And where's Sharon? That's not a mouse, that's a shrew. That's completely different. And some of those things I named were shrews, so it's not all mice. But that's one of Baird's shrews. And he collected it in the middle 1800s. And we still have it. We still have it like all of Baird's specimens at the Smithsonian. And Baird was the first curator of the collections of the Smithsonian and the first assistant secretary. And Roosevelt idolized this guy. He said as much in his autobiography. Decades later, he said, I wanted to be just like Baird. And incidentally, Baird it's an interesting story. He was a student of Audubon. He was young, he was building his collection, Baird, and he had collected some birds, and he had a bunch of them so he could see, he had several of them to compare, and he could say, these seem very similar, but they seem to separate out into two different groups. There are subtle distinctions. And he was 16 years old, Baird, when he did this, slowly realized that he might have an undescribed species on his hand, just from his little boyhood museum. And he did an incredible thing. He wrote a letter to Audubon himself, the man himself, wrote a letter and said, I got these things and I think they're new. And it started this friendship between Audubon and Baird. And they eventually met and they exchanged specimens, and Audubon taught him how to draw, gave him some points on making better specimens. And so Baird was actually, this is interesting, Baird was Roosevelt's primary mentor in absentia, really. He really looked up to Baird and everything that he did. And so in a way you could kind of think of Roosevelt as the academic grandson, in a way, of Audubon. Interesting. But one of the most important things that Baird did, in my opinion, is this map here. Not the map itself, but what that map represents. He had the brilliant idea of initiating what were called the railroad expeditions of the 1850s and 1860s. And what Baird did is the United States Army was beginning to survey the most appropriate routes to the Pacific from the Mississippi. And we're sending huge regiments from the Army to scope out the best routes and to survey them. And well, Baird had a connection to the Army. His wife was the daughter of a high-ranking officer, and he convinced them to allow naturalists to go along on these expeditions, and he convinced even some of the soldiers to volunteer to collect specimens. And so what Baird did, keep in mind, this is trackless terrain. There may have been a few stagecoach, ruts here and there. This is the West before the railroads. They're just tracking the routes. The wildlife is there. Everything is there in a nearly pristine state. And they're getting all the logistics taken care of, and they're going west. And this is just one railroad. They had 4 railroads. And he was basically getting these latitudinal transects across the entire western United States. His collectors intensively collecting all kinds of specimens. And then, conveniently, when the railroads were done, shipping them back by train back to the Smithsonian, where he cataloged them and put it in his collections and described a big chunk of the fauna of the American West. Roosevelt idolized Baird, and he was looking for an opportunity to go on one of these kinds of expeditions to emulate Baird and these intrepid museum naturalists. And he got his chance when his family, when he was 14, when his family decided that they were going to take an extended tour through Egypt and the Middle East. And at first Roosevelt was bummed because, they had to go through Europe and, look at all these paintings and statues and stuff. And okay, another, he had done one when he was a kid, and he's like, I'm just getting started with my museum, now I have to go to Europe. But what they didn't tell him is that he was getting a new shotgun for Christmas, and they let him open it early, and they were gonna let him take that shotgun to Egypt, and you might as well make this into an expedition. He had great parents, Roosevelt, really great parents. And so they went for weeks in Egypt, Roosevelt with his shotgun, and there were reports of him riding wildly on his donkey with his shotgun, bouncing on his back, chasing after things on the crocodile-infested shores of the Nile. and he spent his days collecting specimens for his museum, including this bat. This is, anytime you see a specimen up here, it's probably Roosevelt's, if I don't point that out. This is one of the bats he collected in Egypt from, he was even shooting things off of pyramids, and it's just a different time back then. But one of the things that I want to stress is that he wasn't just, Roosevelt is so unfairly, I think, and too quickly and unfairly accused of or characterized as being bloodthirsty or being this wanton killer. You go look in his catalogs, and as someone who's done all of this stuff and know what work is involved in it, he never shot more than he could prepare. It's easy to collect the specimens. The hard part is, under the hot tropical sun, how do you skin all of these things in time before they start rotting? And I looked at his diaries, and it's like, boom, he knew what he was doing. It's like he's collecting just what, if he collected one big bird, that was it, and he would prep it. But he wasn't just adding things to his catalog, he was taking very detailed notes on natural history. And this is just a preliminary sketch on this slit-faced bat from Africa, and pages of this. One interesting thing someone pointed out to me in one of the talks, if you read one of the last lines there, there's this so-called myth of bats getting tangled in your hair, right? You've heard of that, and everyone knows that's a myth, right? Well, here's Roosevelt, and he's a good observer, and he wasn't someone who really lied. And read that last line. He's talking about the bats, and he said that, they're common around the pyramids and the temples, and often a great nuisance, flying into your face and clinging to your hair. Maybe the bats in Egypt are different. I don't know. So that's Roosevelt in Egypt, and was just so over the top, gung-ho about that he drove his siblings crazy. His younger sister said that anytime Teedy, as she called him, anytime he enters the room, I invariably hear the word bird or skin. That's all he talks about. And then she quipped, certainly was great fun for him. And his brother Elliot complained that he really didn't like sharing a room with someone who left the guts of animals in the wash basin. So we can imagine what Roosevelt was like at that stage. Roosevelt, I better watch my time. Roosevelt went off to Harvard, committed to becoming a professional museum naturalist. In fact, he even declared that he wanted to be a naturalist like Baird, like Audubon, and like all of these other people. Some of you will recognize the name. They're all people that were prominent in this field. They're all people that worked for museums. And the first 2 years were great. He got there, he set up his kit, he brought his taxidermy kit, and he took regular trips to the Adirondacks, and he had been there as a boy and already had notebooks of all kinds of notes on birds and bird calls, and he said he wanted to get up there and collect some specimens, round out his collection, and he was working on this big monograph here. And so all of these specimens are in Roosevelt's collection, and when he was at Oyster Bay, he kept very detailed notes on the appearances of birds during the migrations. It's something that he was very diligent about. In fact, there were records of him. They were in Manhattan and they rented, at that time he didn't own the Oyster Bay house. The family rented a different property. And he would go out to Long Island, to Oyster Bay every weekend because he's got to take his notes on what warblers are showing up, what's here now, what's that. Very important information. And it led to these two publications, The Summer Birds of the Adirondacks in Franklin County, and notes on some birds from Oyster Bay. And these may seem like just lists, but in that time, especially for the Adirondacks, a lot of this was new information. It just wasn't known. And more importantly, he had specimens for them, and those specimens are still there. And by the way, populations of birds change with time. They change with climate change. They change with the introduction of invasive species. They change with any kind of habitat disturbance. And it's thanks to these specimens that Roosevelt and others collected that we actually have a benchmark. We actually have information so that we could understand what's happening in some of these habitats today. But 2 years into his tenure at Harvard as an undergraduate, he faced the fact that things weren't quite working out for him. He became really disillusioned, and the reason is the kind of naturalism that he was interested in, the same stuff that I'm interested in, this adventurous, outdoor naturalism, looking at big animals and getting out there and seeing them in the wild. It just wasn't being taught anymore. American universities were probably having something of their usual inferiority complex with Europe at that time. And in Europe, laboratory science was all the rage. Everything was this reductionist approach where they reduced everything down to tissues and little tiny things that could be described in minute detail under the microscope. And especially in Germany. And the American universities were copying this Germanic model for education. And it's just, Roosevelt, you could read the comments, I won't read them. These are Roosevelt's comments. He's just disgusted, and he loses so much interest in natural history because of the way it's being taught at Harvard. That, and his developing interest in Alice Lee, who's the first one sitting there on the left, and she would in 2 years become his first wife. The combination of those two really convinced Roosevelt halfway through Harvard, and he didn't just drift away from being a naturalist. He declared, I'm giving up becoming a naturalist. I will not. He wrote letters to his friends. He said, that's it. If I can't be the kind of naturalist that I want to be, that I know I should be, I'm not going to be a naturalist at all. And he studied law and entered politics instead. But you can't just say you're not a naturalist. This is part of Roosevelt's personality. It was with him probably from birth. And as much as he tried to shed his naturalism, he quickly found himself needing a way to fill that void, to get that fix, to have that adventure, and to study those animals. And he went west. He came here, and he got into hunting and became a big game hunter, and came here and wanted to shoot a buffalo while there was still buffalo left to shoot, was the way he described it. And the northern herd by that point, if he had been there 6 months earlier, he would have had better luck. There were more then. It was just very rapidly, the populations here were being shot out by market hunters and by a whole host of factors. He also, in saying that, he wanted to shoot a buffalo while there was still buffalo left to shoot. Another interpretation of that, which I think is also true, is he wanted to experience something of the Wild West that he had read about. That's also part of it. It wasn't just getting the buffalo, but it was also, he wanted to stitch himself into that scene, and as soon as he got there, he kind of realized he might have been a little bit too late. But he was captivated with the country, captivated with North Dakota and the Badlands, and was so enamored. He had his famous buckskin suit made, and got into the ranching business. And this is perhaps, I think, the most pivotal period in Roosevelt's time. This is when he went through the 4 years that he was here, he went through his most dramatic transformation. And one of the reasons for that is it was only shortly after he got into the ranching business that tragedy struck. He and his first wife had their first child, Alice. She was born. And 2 days later, his wife died. And on the same day, Valentine's Day, his mother died just a few hours later. And Roosevelt was just crushed. He was just devastated. It was too much of a blow. He was New York State, in the New York State Assembly. He finished his business up in Albany, New York, and he just went west to mourn and to hunt and to be alone. And he went on several lonely hunts where he'd go off on his own and he'd hang around his ranch, and he even took a really long, almost expedition-like trip to the Bighorn Mountains. And it was there that he found solace, and it was there that he started, rediscovering himself as a naturalist. He just couldn't escape it. But it's also the time when he really changed as a hunter. For a very brief period, he was kind of, I would say, a little bit, maybe a little bit brazen or a little bit reckless. But he very quickly, you could read that. It's very poetic. It's very Rooseveltian, and all of his writing is like that. And it's clear that there was a romance to it, that he was enamored with this idea of being out in the wilderness and studying animals and studying them on their terms as a hunter. And so when it was raining, he was out there in the rain. And when it was cold, he was out there when it was cold. And he was playing the role of a predator. And he was observing how these prey species evaded him. And he started to realize that so much of the biology of these, like this elk, so much of their biology is predator avoidance. Like, so much of it is, it's a totally different experience. And he learned, he developed this deep knowledge of species, of the big game in the West, and had made up his mind that he could probably become the naturalist he wanted to be, but that Harvard wouldn't let him be. And he made up his mind. He said, all right, I know what this hunting thing's all about. And most hunters, they're not even paying attention to the game. And he knew a lot of naturalists, and most of them were sitting back in their offices. And he knew they didn't go out and look at the specimens. And he said, there's a real need for someone like me to study wildlife in the wild. And he made up his mind to become a hunter-naturalist. And by hunter-naturalist, this is one of those terms that I think gets twisted around. People typically think of it as, oh, he's a hunter, and yeah, he's got this side, and he likes nature. Yeah, he's got a side interest. And no. What a hunter-naturalist is someone who's a naturalist that uses the skills of a hunter, that uses the prowess of a hunter to study his species. And Roosevelt got out there and spent weeks and days determined to, through hunting, that hunting was the drive that got him out there, but he was relentless in pursuit of these behaviors that he wanted to observe. He called it the hidden lives of the animals of the wilderness. And he was going to write books about his hunting trips that are heavily laden with natural history. And Hunting Trips of a Ranchman was the first book in this newfound naturalist career that he had. And this led to this 4-year period when he was here out west led to so many transformations. This book led to yet another transformation, which is when the reviews came in. It was a good book. It's a good read. And the reviews were generally positive. But one review came in from a very high-ranking reviewer. His name was George Bird Grinnell. And he was generally praiseworthy of Roosevelt and said, yeah, this is good. There's lots of good natural history in here, but a lot of misconceptions are perpetuated, and there are a couple of errors. And this Roosevelt guy, he means well, he does good work, but I'm paraphrasing here. But something to the effect of, he's still pretty much a novice, and keep that in mind as you read the book. Roosevelt was furious when he heard this. And he went storming into the office of George Bird Grinnell. He was Grinnell was a museum man too. He was a paleontologist at the Yale Peabody Museum, and another Audubon connection had grown up on the Audubon land in Upper Manhattan, New York. He didn't know Audubon himself. I'll have a picture of Grinnell in the next slide, but he played with the Audubon grandchildren, adored Audubon's wife, Lucy Audubon, who he called Grandma Audubon. Just grew up playing in Audubon's attic with all of his specimens. And so Grinnell and Roosevelt had a lot of things in common. And Roosevelt stormed in there and demanded an explanation. And they got to talking, and Roosevelt had already begun to formulate his conservation ethic. He was already dismayed at what he could see was happening out west, but he never really felt powerful enough, or he never really knew how he could do anything about it. When he met with Grinnell, who is the editor of this magazine, Forest and Stream, not Field and Stream, Forest and Stream, and he had been advocating for protecting the game in the West, for getting protections at Yellowstone. He was really trying to rally sportsmen to do something about what was going on out West. Well, you get Roosevelt and Grinnell together in a room, and they really hit it off. And by the end of that, they realized that they could work together and that something needed to be done. And Grinnell is the guy who founded the Audubon Society. The original Audubon Society was founded by George Bird Grinnell. That's George Bird Grinnell up there on the upper right. And they decided they wanted to found something very similar, but for mammals. And they came up, it was Roosevelt's idea, let's call it the Boone and Crockett Club. And it was founded on the same principles. And this, with the founding of this club, it really solidified Roosevelt's ethic from this point forward with regards to wildlife and game and hunting and ethics and the West and conservation. Incidentally, another person who played a very big role in this transformation of Roosevelt and this coming around to being much more proactive in conservation is the woman below Grinnell. That's Edith Kermit Carroll, who was his childhood sweetheart. They were, like when they were babies, they were pushed side by side in the same pram. They grew up together. She became his second wife. And together, he already had one child, and together with Edith, they had 5 more. 6 children. And it's no coincidence that Roosevelt was a dedicated family man, and it's no coincidence that he started thinking about what's going to be left for my children and for my grandchildren and my great-great-grandchildren. His mind was focused on these things more because of that. He went on to have an impressive political career. Yet through it all, he continued to collect his museum specimens, like all of these cougars from Meeker Ranch in Colorado. This is one drawer in the Smithsonian, all collected by Teddy, or I shouldn't call him Teddy, Theodore. One below that, and then another one below that. He collected a huge number of them, and again, unfairly criticized for being bloodthirsty or being trigger happy, or no. What Roosevelt was doing is he was collecting them for this guy, Clinton Hart Merriam, who was the most prominent mammologist in America at that time. He was picking up where Baird left off with his railroad surveys, and what he was doing is sending expeditions out to continue this work, to collect specimens, to document all of the species in the West, and to very accurately map where they came from. Hundreds and hundreds of maps like this, and he was going to, it was called that invented his own style of field work called the American method, or the Merriam method. And he was going to make sense of the entire West. And Roosevelt was contributing to that. Merriam tapped him for that. And he collected these specifically to show Merriam that there was Merriam was trying to name all kinds of, trying to split mountain lions up into any number of species, and Roosevelt thought this was ridiculous. He said Merriam sent him a publication describing some new species of mountain lion from Nevada, and Roosevelt replied, he's like, these are the same exact animal. He said, if it's true that he's going to split the mountain lions up into how many species, then I guarantee you I could go back to Long Island and I could describe 57 new species of red fox, is what he said. Roosevelt was right. Merriam was wrong. Roosevelt collected these and showed that it's just a lot of variation in these big species. He became president on account of a assassin's bullet and pretty much stopped hunting for this reason, the famous black bear hunt in Mississippi. We don't need to repeat it, but he was president and he refused to shoot the bear. It was wounded. Someone tied it up. They said, shoot it. That's against my ethics. It spawned the whole teddy bear phenomena. He had the thing euthanized, and he saved the specimen, put it in a museum. But instead, he focused on his presidency and putting his agenda to effect. And we should be thankful and grateful that he did, because through his presidency, as someone has already said, from 0 to 230 million acres protected. And he's rightly remembered for this legacy. That's Roosevelt's greatest contribution. But oftentimes, this is where the story of Roosevelt the Naturalist or Roosevelt the Conservationist ends. It comes to a nice, tidy end right there. But I think there's still a little bit more to the story. And he was very dedicated to, as I've been driving home, he was very dedicated to this idea of documenting nature, of documenting specimens. And in my opinion, and from everything that I know about our profession, the profession that I'm in, is Roosevelt, yes, he protected 230 million acres of land, but he was such a visionary, and he was thinking so far in the future that he was thinking beyond what comes next after we've preserved all of the land that we could preserve. Roosevelt knew that he couldn't preserve every piece of land. He knew there would be land that would be destroyed and that would be paved over or developed. And he knew what little land, the pieces, ultimately it comes to a point where you've preserved everything that you can preserve and you've transformed everything that you can transform. Then what? Roosevelt was already thinking ahead to that. And that was the essence of all of this obsession with museum specimens and with collecting. This is not an advertisement for museum collections. This is me telling you that this lifelong passion of Roosevelt's to collect and preserve specimens was the next step in Roosevelt's ongoing conservation legacy. It doesn't stop with the 230 million acres. Those 230 million acres need to be managed. And what about the land that hasn't? We need to have some record of what was there in the places that are developed to better manage what is set aside. This is fundamental, and Roosevelt saw this way ahead of his time. He had a very strong conviction that museum specimens were important. And if you don't believe me, let me tell you about this picture on the left. This is Roosevelt in the geyser region of Yellowstone. He's there in the fur coat. John Burroughs is in the back on their famous trip. There's snow on the ground. They're in this horse-drawn sleigh. And there's Roosevelt. They're going along, and then something catches his eye again. And it's not a seal, but it's something brown, and it's small. And then all of a sudden, Burroughs is looking at him, and Burroughs describes this. It's like Roosevelt's jumping off of this sled, and he's fumbling around in the snow, and he gets his hat, and he's trying to catch something, and it's this vole on the top. It's a vole. And he caught it, and he said, I said I wasn't going to kill anything in the park, but I just have to collect this one specimen. He dispatched it, and on the spot, he just made an impromptu museum specimen. I guess he had some tags with him, and which is not unusual, because museum people, they walk around with these things. And he made the specimen, and you know what he said? He said, this is a really remote area. It hasn't been well sampled. This is Yellowstone. This is an important place. I need to collect this, and I need to send it to Merriam at the Smithsonian. It might be something important, and he did. And I put the vole below it to highlight his dedication, because the one below is from his boyhood collection. He collected that and prepared that when he was 12 years old. 12 years old, he did the one on the bottom. I know, they just look like brown blobs. What's the big deal? They're voles. But the one on the bottom, he collected when he was 12 years old. And the one at the top, he collected when he was a sitting president. This is one of the few examples of someone who was actually president a sitting president actually collecting specimens like this and putting them in museums. If that's not dedication, and if that isn't indicative of his strong-held feelings about, I won't call it museum collections, I want to call it this next phase of his conservation legacy. The next phase of his conservation legacy is, okay, protect the land. What comes next? What comes next is having the data, having this archive, having this library of biodiversity that future generations are going to thank us for, because this is the key to managing or understanding what you lost and managing what you have left. And I am wrapping up here, but the final proof of his dedication to this kind of expeditionary work that he was so enamored with as a child is when he finished in the White House, he was arguably the most recognized, if not the most popular man in the world. He could have done anything he wanted. He could have done anything at all, almost anything he wanted. And what did he do? He decided, I want to lead a museum exploration expedition for the Smithsonian expedition, and he did. And he did it for 1 year. It's a 1-year expedition, and again, significantly, when he went west, the railroads are key, and Roosevelt knew this. Railroads gave you the access, but shortly after the railroads went in, progress came and development came, and then you lost everything. It was a little bit too late in the West. Baird wasn't late when he did his railroad surveys, but Roosevelt was late when he wanted to go out and experience the true Wild West. Well, in East Africa, he realized he was ahead of the curve. And he said, they're putting these railroads in, and I'm going to have an expedition, and I'm going to do like what Baird did. And we're going to use these, and these are the rail routes. This is the route of the, and you probably can't make out the map, but he landed on the coast, went through Kenya. Most of the expedition was in Kenya, went through Uganda, parts of Congo, and into South Sudan and up the Nile. Kind of the reverse of his boyhood trip going back up the Nile. And they collected along the way, and he brought naturalists from the Smithsonian. And he was serious about collecting specimens to the point where they brought home a total of some 23,000 specimens when you include the anthropological stuff and some insects and fish, and they collected all kinds of things, but mostly they collected birds, mammals, and plants. And this collection stands today as the most important record of that part of the world, bar none. Again, unfairly dismissed as a mere hunting trip. You look at a picture like that, and oh, Teddy, what are you doing? You're shooting the hippo. Well, no, this is not bloodthirsty Teddy. This is Roosevelt collecting specimens, and these are hippo skulls in a museum that I guarantee you, because it's my job, those things are studied by researchers all the time that are asking all kinds of questions that are related to conservation, and having these specimens is crucial to, absolutely crucial to conservation. Anything, the distributions of species, the names of species, how we identify species, their ecological associations, their parasites, tracking invasive species, epidemiology, you name it, it's all there in specimens. It's a documentation of life on Earth. And so here's Roosevelt's team. He shot that hippo, and they've skinned it out, and he insisted that they save the full skeletons of everything, and they took all of these intense measurements, and they've got to get the skull out of that hippo, and and someone has to carry it. This is what's incredible about this expedition. They weren't just collecting mice, they were collecting a big series of things like hippos. Not big, but they got enough that they needed to do the science. They were describing new species even while they were still in the field. Well, it's a rodent, yeah, it's a burrowing rodent, kind of like a gopher, but unprecedented because they were collecting these things on expedition and actually writing and publishing papers while they're still on safari, with the porters carrying things, and Roosevelt's writing in front of his tent, and he's mailing these things back and getting them published while he's still traipsing around Africa. It's incredible. This one on the right is a bat-eared fox, and it's interesting because they got that specimen at Naivasha Station. It's just right there in the train station. Again, they were basing their safari out of the out of the trains and then taking these big loops away from the trains. And they just got this bad-eared fox right there, right by the tracks, right where the train stopped. And they realized immediately that it was something completely new. And the funny thing is, the Brits were getting a little twitchy, about this time. Like, oh, who are these Americans coming here? They're taking all of our stuff and they're describing everything and they're getting all the credit. And they found out about this bad-eared fox, and Roosevelt found out that they found out. And then there was a big push to rush this thing back to the States so that they could get it properly described, and they did, and they named it. A little bit of British-American rivalry there. Exhibitions were on the agenda. They did everything. Everything is wrapped up into this expedition. Here's the taxidermy shop at the Smithsonian. Maybe you can make out the lions there in the foreground and the finished product there at the end. Perhaps most controversial was his decision, and Roosevelt wrestled with this. Do I shoot the northern white rhinos? They were only recently discovered. Roosevelt knew that it was just a matter of time before they likely went extinct, and he really sort of thought about this. What happened with the white rhinos is there's two subspecies, and for a long time they were only known in South Africa. And they were totally shot out, and they got down to just like a handful of specimens. No one ever bothered to collect any specimens. They were like 2 fragments of specimens. No one knew anything about the southern subspecies, completely unknown. It was just completely devastated. And then, decades later, they discovered a population in the north. Roosevelt described it as it would be like finding buffalo in Texas and Ecuador. And that was the situation in Africa, same latitude, same distance. They found this huge population, not huge, but big enough in the north. And Roosevelt said, I saw what happened in South Africa, and I think it's best to get specimens. He shot 5. 3 of them went on exhibit, and then the other 2 are full-blown specimens, which, incidentally, I think I could say that these specimens are used, and we use them. Remember, this is my job to manage these collections. They're used. They're used in real conservation. They're used in good things. Good things are happening using some of these materials that relate directly to conservation. And he published this 100-plus page monograph on the biology of northern white rhinos. His biggest critics were members of the big game hunting fraternity. They gave Roosevelt a hard time, but he said, I'm not shooting these as a hunter. I'm shooting these for posterity. I'm shooting these for future generations. Pulling it all together, he was a lifelong writer. He was a wonderful natural history writer. This is one of his earliest, describing a ladybug. It's very. You should get on the online Dickinson, the resources, because this is from there. A lot of this stuff is from there. You could just read through his diaries and all of these catalogs and diaries. They're all free and publicly. They're up there now. They're scanned. You can access them. This is just one describing a ladybug. He did that his whole life too. He published 2 things as a result of that expedition. One is little known, but life histories of African game animals. This is a gem, and I don't know why it's not more referenced or better known than it is. This is natural history pretty much at its best for the time. Accurate, hands-on, eyes-on descriptions of everything Roosevelt. And Roosevelt was, despite his bad eyesight, he noticed everything. It's just an observation is a difficult thing to do, and Roosevelt had a real talent for observation. The other one, of course, is more famous, African game trails. And yes, it's a hunting story, but one of the points I want to make is that Roosevelt wasn't just about saving land. He wasn't just about saving specimens. He was about saving the memory of what it was like when you had unfenced wilderness, when there were places you could go and there were animals that could eat you and just might. And Roosevelt, the visionary, the forward-thinking, ever forward-thinking, could see the day when people they wouldn't believe it if you tried to say, yeah, these things used to run wild. I mean, there's a time coming in our future where probably a lot of these animals are either only going to be in zoos or they're going to be in such fenced or defined areas that they might as well be something like a zoo. And Roosevelt could see that there'd be a time in the future where People just wouldn't believe that these things were wild. He wanted to document what it was like to actually be out there and actually face down a charging lion. And that's a big part of what African Game Trails is. Roosevelt was such a celebrity, he ushered in the heyday of Natural History Museum building. This is the Smithsonian being expanded. Actually, it was being built while he was in Africa. Actually, Roosevelt as president, signed the authorization, came from Congress, and he signed it. That's the American Museum of Natural History being expanded. This is Roosevelt, plays a big part in that. And he just ushered in this period. He was such a strong advocate for museums. Nobody knows anything about this. It's almost like Roosevelt is so big and so dynamic as a naturalist that he's almost too big to process. No one, you can't just encompass everything that he was, even just as a naturalist. And so we've tended to just flatten and compress his life as a naturalist and a conservationist down to this very just so story. And from my background, I'm researching Roosevelt, and I'm seeing from the time he was a little boy until well into, to his very last day, he was dedicated to something that it's not on anyone's radar. No one knows about it. And the more I studied it, the more I realized this is actually part of his overall conservation vision. This isn't just a hobby or something he was interested in. This is something he deliberately put in motion as the very next step beyond. What do you do after you get those 230 million acres? The point I want to make here is that Theodore Roosevelt was among the first to recognize that natural history collections are essential to effective conservation and that they would be invaluable to future generations. Theodore Roosevelt went through several stages as a naturalist. As a boy, he expressed his interest through natural history museums. As a young man, he harnessed his ethos as a hunter to transform himself into a conservationist, and he put this ethic into effect as a politician. Finally, in the last decade of his life, Roosevelt brought all of these attributes together when he led the Smithsonian African expedition. Recognizing how Theodore Roosevelt progressed through all of these stages as a naturalist and how he brought them all together in the end is the key to understanding the complex thought process and vision of this incredible man. Thank you.
Good.
Do you want to do questions?
No, we're fine, yeah. We have time for a couple of questions. And I should say, after this, there'll be a book signing in the lobby, so you can get some of your books and you'll sign them. Mm-hmm. We're glad that you're going to do that. I want to ask a quick question here, just to clarify. So here's the famous Berryman teddy bear.
That's the actual bear.
That's the actual bear, but so he wouldn't kill it, but it did die. Can you explain that?
It did die, and so it was stunned. His guide stunned it with a pistol, and I could see from the skull. I didn't put it up there, but he fractured the skull, and it was still alive, and it was brutal. It's not anything any hunter should do. And tied it to a tree and said, "There you go, Roosevelt. There's your bear. You could shoot it now." And what Roosevelt did, Roosevelt had good stuff, and he had a Tiffany knife, that he always carried, and. He just handed it to someone else and said, I can't kill this. You put it out of its misery. And someone else dispatched it by...
Because it had been damaged.
It had been damaged and it was going to die, and someone put it out of its misery.
But he had nothing to do with the death.
He had nothing to do with it.
Right. And okay, just wanted to clear that up. Now, back here just for a second. So I think I heard you say you're going to give this skull to the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. Did I hear that right?
That's right.
Yeah, I thought you heard it here, right here. Thank you. That's great. Because you're sitting on a sea of these things. This is small stuff for you, but for us, it's like the treasure of treasures. So thank you for that. Yeah.
You got it.
We have time for a couple of questions. You go ahead first.
I realize early tribal people are scientists and wrote TR's time might have been later than theirs. However, did he ever interact with the tribal people and add to his knowledge from them and their long history of natural world?
What did he learn from tribal people in Africa about their own natural history?
Africa.
Yeah.
In America.
Or America,
In
too,
America
yeah.
or Africa? Well, he certainly did both. He was certainly very respectful and studious of the cultures he interacted with, and even the cultures he didn't interact with. He was a very much interested in cultures. I know more about what he did in Africa, and I think the honest answer to that is he would have done better to do a better job looking into that. He was certainly respectful, and again, I didn't get into it too much in North America, but I know the groups he worked with in Africa, he had a good knowledge of them and was respected. And in fact, they gave him an honorific, Bwana, which is great man, almost like a king. And he treated them better than any other expedition. But there's always indigenous knowledge, and indigenous knowledge can be tapped for the benefit of some of these expeditions. And I just don't think they did that back then. I don't think it was a Roosevelt thing. I think we're better at that now. I can tell you that. But I don't know if that answers your question, but I think he was sensitive to cultures, but he probably could have done more to harness that to the fullest.
There's a question back here. Speak up, please.
Darrin, 2 points.
Yeah.
One, very good presentation.
Thank you.
And number 2, when you're talking about the African adventure, which I'm very familiar with and read that book a couple of times, it reminded me of Carl Ackley, who you're probably familiar with.
Right.
That came after Roosevelt. And I was wondering, do you know whether or not Ackley was influenced by Roosevelt?
Oh,
Influence
yeah.
of Roosevelt on Ackley.
Absolutely. I mean, so Ackley was a prominent naturalist and taxidermist who worked freelance for the Field Museum and for the American Museum, put together beautiful, some of the most iconic halls, the Africa Hall at the American Museum of Natural History. Innovative, early pioneer in wildlife photography. Really great guy who was a conservationist and was really hated shooting animals, but did it because that's how people learned about it. In an era before, when photography, wildlife photography, was in its infancy, he did these dioramas. He was a sculptor and an artist, and he revered Roosevelt, and they had a very famous meeting under the tree when their expeditions met, and they had a long conversation about life. And Ackley dedicated this is inside baseball here a little bit, but Ackley wanted to create a Roosevelt Memorial Hall in the American Museum of Natural History, that beautiful African hall with all of the 2-tiered dioramas. And Ackley died in Africa of dysentery while he was putting that together, so then it became the Ackley Hall. But the two of them were mutual fan club.
Let's go to a couple more questions. Am I missing? I want to ask you about Kermit.
Yeah.
So Kermit was a fortunate son. He got to not only go on the African safari,
right.
but he went to South America on the River of Doubt trip.
Yeah.
What do you see the influence? Where's Kermit in all of this hunting and
Kermit was
science?
the one son. They all hunted the boys, the Roosevelt boys, but Kermit was the one that really took to it, like his father. Mm-hmm. And he was 19 when he went to Africa and joined his father for the year-long expedition. And that was because, again, it was because Roosevelt knew that he was living in a time where it was ephemeral, it wasn't going to last. And he wanted, it gets back to this thing, he wanted his children and he wanted his future generations, he wanted to share it. He wanted his son to see it, to the point where he said, you could skip a year at Harvard, you'll graduate a year late, this is more important. The River of Doubt, Kermit more went to protect Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And I don't talk about the River of Doubt. There have been a number of really excellent books written on the River of Doubt. It wasn't so much didn't turn out to be a collecting expedition. It was more of a geographic expedition to explore a river. And my story is told with the Roosevelt realizing his lifelong dream and doing that safari. But Kermit Roosevelt never should have been on that trip. Never should have been on that trip. It was just a danger. I've been in some of those areas, and it's just, Kermit was there to protect him.
It turned into a life-threatening ordeal.
And it did, yeah.
Any other questions here? Am I missing anybody?
Yeah.
Yes, here. Chancellor.
I believe Roosevelt lost his son in the First World War, is that right?
Quite
That's right, Clinton.
Yeah. Did he have any thoughts, if you're saying he was concerned, or the 100th anniversary of the American entry in the war, was there any conflict between his sense of that adventure and the vigorous life and what modern war was becoming?
Did Roosevelt understand that modern war was quite different from the Spanish-American War and so on? This is not your area, of course.
Yeah, it's not in my area, but certainly he was a military man, and he watched closely the development of technology and warfare. And yeah, I think it's fair to say he could see it. He was the first president to fly in a biplane, and he was very much involved in the new technologies. And
He was worried what would be left for his grandchildren. Does that reinforced, I guess, by the
oh, I see what you're saying.
So did he see the coming mayhem of modern warfare?
I get you. I think he did. Yeah.
Of course, Woodrow Wilson said that to Roosevelt, said, I can't let you take another Rough Rider group because
Yeah.
war is not what you think it used to be.
The thing with Roosevelt is he was constantly looking at the next crisis. He was looking at that the crisis of wildlife and the destruction of habitats, and that was his focus in his life. But he was also thinking ahead to all of these other crises, and you could branch out on Roosevelt into any different direction, whether it's warfare or anything else or economics, and he's constantly looking forward. How can I head off the next big thing that's going to happen that's going to impact my children? Sorry.
That's great. Go ahead.
Two questions.
Yeah.
First one is, would you say that Roosevelt was more of a specialist in terms of a naturalist versus a general naturalist? In other words, did he collect, doing a botanical collecting, insect collecting?
No, he didn't.
Was he a specialist or a generalist as a naturalist?
I would call him a generalist, but he focused on the groups that interested him, which were the bigger animals, the birds and the mammals. He didn't. I can't see Roosevelt pressing plants.
Did he classify any species, find new species?
He certainly recognized them, but he let his Smithsonian naturalists do that. He didn't want to get. He didn't want to be a brick maker. He wanted to build the castle, as he said.
I have a big question for you, but I just
Yeah.
want to ask one little one first, and that is, so the splitters versus the lumpers.
Yeah.
And Merriam was a splitter, and Roosevelt ridiculed that.
Yeah.
Then Merriam found a subspecies of elk that he named. So isn't there kind of an irony that Merriam then gave a subspecies name to Roosevelt? Thus saying, you don't get the name unless you accept this split.
There was a friendly sort of rivalry between Merriam and they were both vying for what the field of mammalogy would become. And Roosevelt wanted to push it in the direction of more. Roosevelt had a great point. He would say to Merriam, he's like, you could study these mice anytime. They're not going anywhere. He's like, it's these big species that we need to study now. And he wanted to push it in the direction of studying their behavior while their land was still intact, their ranges were still intact. And Merriam was, being the scientist and collecting the data. And yeah, they had that friendly rivalry. And they were both wrong at times and both right. Merriam sometimes got it right. Roosevelt sometimes got it right. They both got it wrong. It's science. It does that. It self-corrects.
Amazing, a president of the United States who could keep up with the best scientists in the world on questions of this sort.
Yeah, and there's like a famous incident where before they were going to the African expedition, he had all of his team. These are professionals in the field. He had them up to his house, and he had some skulls of all of the African mammals that they were going to encounter sent over from the American Museum. They're all spread out at Oyster Bay. And they're going through, and the specialists are looking at Roosevelt, and he's picking up the skulls, and he's identifying every one, and he's going into details on there. He's just a walking encyclopedia, and they all marveled at his ability to do that. I don't know how he did it. He just seemed to have multiple brains or doing things at once.
Sharon Kilzer is going to go up and make some announcements. So I want to ask you a big, tough question.
Yeah.
So, first of all, let me say I've been standing here for 12 years listening to these programs, and they've been amazing. We've had some of the best scholars you can possibly imagine. This was a brilliant piece of work, and you made the best possible case for Roosevelt as a serious museum naturalist. And so I just want to ask, and I don't necessarily have a point of view on this, but there's another school that says, sure, granting what you've done, although you've done pioneering work in this area, but he also had some bloodlust too, that these things have to be, they're not altogether separable, and that you
Roosevelt-
made a kind of an indignant
Okay.
case that this is not so.
Well, I think I said that he is unfairly characterized as being overly, maybe I didn't say overly, but he certainly had a bloodlust. He certainly had that side. But I think that's something you
It's
have
an
to-
easy judgment.
Well, no, I think you need to have a little bit of that to do this kind of work. You can't be, there are people that want to work with me, and I take them in the field, and they can't do it, and that's fine. And I understand that everyone has a different point beyond which they can't go. And to be this kind of naturalist, you just have to have a higher tolerance for this kind of work. And Roosevelt had that higher tolerance, and certainly earlier in his youth, he was a little bit wild, and and I talk about him in my book. I don't sugarcoat Roosevelt. And there are instances where he just, shooting at dolphins, when it's just crazy stuff, or shooting too many things. But that quickly, with the founding of the Boone and Crockett, that established his ethic.
He matured over time.
Yeah, he matured over time, but he almost had to go through that phase. He did it, and it's like, you know what, this is not who I am. This is not what I want to represent, and then he changed.
Last thought.
That's a very interesting point. And being a hunter conservationist for decades now and associating with hundreds of people like that, I can understand exactly what you're saying.
Right.
What Roosevelt was like in his heart.
Right.
But it is extremely hard to explain to non-hunters,
Well-
non-hunter conservationists. They just have a tough time getting that. Okay, so here's a question.
Sure.
What words do you have that maybe you could use to explain to the non-hunter conservationists what's in the hunter conservationist's heart and mind?
Explain the ethos of the hunter conservationist.
I would say if I had an anti-hunter, someone who is uncomfortable with hunters being conservationists, I would say that I perfectly understand. I understand that people have different sentiments, and people have different, one person can do one thing and another person can do another thing, and I can respect that. But the one point that I would make to this hypothetical person is that you have to accept me and let me do what I'm doing for this reason. Unless you are willing to live in complete ignorance, don't judge me for what I'm doing, because what I'm doing is contributing to the base of knowledge, and that knowledge is benefiting not just humankind, but it's benefiting wildlife, and it's necessary. Roosevelt had great quotes where, death by cold, death by violence. These are the normal endings. He was a hunter. He knew that things froze to death in winter, that they were killed by other animals. And he knew that life depended on death. And I understand that there are people who are not comfortable with that sentiment, but they need to at least concede to me that I'm different, and I think I'm fortunate in that I'm able to contribute in this way, because I can go a little bit further and I can contribute by doing this important work.
What a fabulous start. Darrin Lunde.
Thanks.